hands locked on me. My stepdad Doug froze mid-hurricane as sparks flew from the generator. Rain pounded our Louisiana night. I chased him out. He gripped tight. 2 months of edgy games exploded fast. I barged into his room, daring it all. My mom was there, watching. What she did next. Insane twist. The hurricane hit our house in Baton Rouge, Louisiana like a freight train, wind howling, lights flickering out in a snap, and I, Jane, stood in the living room, watching the windows rattle. My stepdad, Doug, a 59-year-old ex-Navy mechanic with hands like steel traps, swore loud and bolted for the back door, yelling about the generator out by the patio. Mom was at her insurance office, stuck late with storm claims, and I didn't think, just grabbed a hoodie, yanked it on, and ran after him into the pouring rain, my sneakers slapping wet grass. Thunder cracked, lightning flashed, and I shouted I'd help, even though I knew jack about machines. He turned, soaked, his gray shirt clinging, and said I'd just get in the way. I caught up, rain stinging my face, and he was already at the generator, yanking the cover off, wires sparking in the dark. I leaned in, trying to hold the flashlight steady, my hands shaking from the cold, and he barked at me to back off, too close to the live stuff. A spark popped, bright and loud, and he grabbed my shoulders hard, shoving me away, his rough palms digging into me through the hoodie. I stumbled, caught my balance, and his hands stayed there, tight, longer than they needed to, his eyes locked on mine under the flickering light. My breath hitched, rain dripping off his jaw, and I said he didn't have to push so hard, bet he liked saving me anyway. He let go fast, turned back to the wires, muttering I was a damn fool, stay out of it. I stepped closer, my arm brushing his soaked sleeve, and said he looked good out here, bet he'd fixed worse storms on a ship. He twisted a wire, hand steady despite the rain, and said ships didn't have crazy girls running into danger, go inside. I smirked, bumped his elbow with mine, and told him crazy kept it fun, bet he'd missed that since the Navy. He yanked the starter cord, the generator coughing to life, and shot me a look, sharp, dark, saying I was pushing it already. I laughed, leaned in, my shoulder near his, and said pushing was my thing, bet he'd pull me back if I fell. He gripped the cover, slamming it shut, his knuckles brushing my wrist, and said I'd fall on my own, didn't need his help. The rain pounded, lightning splitting the sky, and I grabbed the flashlight tighter, aiming it at his hands, saying he was too tough to let me, bet he'd catch me anyway. He stood, towered over me, his jacket dripping, and said catching wasn't his job, bet I'd learn that quick. I stepped up, my knee bumping his leg, and told him he'd caught me already, bet he liked it more than he'd admit. He rubbed his face, water streaking, his hand hovering near my arm, and said I was the storm he didn't sign up for, go dry off. I grinned, bumped his hip with mine, and said storms were his thing, bet he'd ride this one out. Then the back door banged open. Imam's car must have pulled in early, her voice yelling about the power. I froze, stepped back, and Doug turned, grabbing a rag from his pocket, wiping his hands like nothing happened. I bolted inside, shouting I'd grab towels, leaving him by the humming generator, rain still falling. I hit the kitchen, heard him stomp in behind me, and knew I'd sparked something wild, wet, and not fading fast. A few days after the hurricane, the rain had stopped, but the air in our Baton Rouge house still hung heavy, damp clinging to everything. Mom was back at her insurance office, sorting claims from the storm, and I found Doug out on the back porch, scrubbing mud off rain gutters with a wire brush, his old flannel rolled up to his elbows. I stepped out, barefoot on the wet boards, and leaned against the railing, watching him scrape, his hands steady, focused. He didn't look up, just said I'd better not track mud and Imam'd have his head. I smirked, kicked a pebble off the porch, and said he looked hot cleaning up, bet he'd scrubbed decks like that in the Navy. He paused, brushed mid-air, and shot me a glance, narrow, gruff, saying decks didn't talk back, unlike me. I stepped closer, my knee brushing the chair he'd dragged out, and told him talking back was my charm, bet he'd missed that out at sea. He went back to scrubbing, his elbow flexing near me, and said charm wasn't the word, more like a headache. I grinned, leaned on the chair arm, my hand near his on the gutter, and said headaches kept him sharp, bet he'd handled worse than me. He grabbed a rag, wiped his hands, his fingers grazing the edge of my wrist, and said worse didn't run into storms, bet I'd learn to sit still. I slid closer, my arm brushing his sleeve, and picked up the brush he'd dropped, twirling it, saying he looked good wet and mad, bet he'd wrestled bigger messes than this. He snatched it back, his hand brushing mine slow, and said messes didn't flirt, bet I'd trip over my own game. I laughed, bumped his shoulder with mine, and told him tripping was fun, bet he'd catch me like last time. He turned, his knee nudging mine, and said catching wasn't a promise, don't count on it. I leaned in, my elbow pressing his arm, and said counting was boring, bet he'd jump in anyway, tough guy like him. He stood, grabbed the gutter, and hauled it to the edge of the porch, his boots thudding, water dripping off his hands. I followed, my hip near his, and said he moved fast, bet he'd outrun that hurricane if he had to. He set it down, turned, his chest an inch from mine, and said running was smarter than chasing sparks, bet I'd figure that out. I grinned, bumped his elbow again, and told him sparks were the best part, bet he felt them too. He gripped the railing, his knuckles tight, and said I was pushing buttons, same as out there. I stepped up, my hand tapping the rail near his, and said buttons worked, bet he'd push back if he hated it. The porch creaked, wind picking up, and I grabbed the rag, wiped a smudge off the chair slow, holding his gaze, saying he cleaned up nice, bet he'd shine under pressure. He took it, his fingers brushing mine, and said pressure was my thing, bet I'd crack first. I smirked, leaned closer, my knee brushing his leg, and told him cracking was half the fun, bet he'd stick around to see it. He didn't move, just stood there, rag dangling, the air snapping tight. Then Mom's car horn blared, she was home, early again. I stepped back, grabbed the brush, tossed it to him, and said I'd let him finish, bet he'd miss me. I bolted inside, leaving him with the gutters, knowing I'd left him simmering, still hooked. 10 days after the porch, I carried a mug of coffee into Doug's little office off the hall in our Baton Rouge house, where he sat hunched over a desk cluttered with old maps, tracing lines with a pencil. Mom was at her insurance job, the house humming quietly under a gray sky, and I set the mug down near his elbow, letting my hand linger close to his as the steam curled up. He didn't look up, just kept marking, so I leaned on the desk edge, my knee brushing his chair, and said he looked like a badass navigator, bet he'd bossed storms like a pro back in the day. He shot me a sharp glance, pencil pausing, and said storms didn't need bossing, just surviving, unlike me, always yapping. I smirked, tapped a map with my finger, flirty, saying he was sexy when he took charge, bet he'd steer me right too. He grabbed my hand fast, his grip rough, pinning it to the desk, and said I was playing with the wrong guy, cut it out. I didn't pull back, slid closer, my elbow nudging his arm, and told him playing with him was the fun part, bet he'd missed a little chaos since the Navy. He let go, leaned back in his chair, his knee bumping mine under the desk, and said chaos wasn't his thing, too loud, like me. I grinned, rested my hand on the map near his, fingers almost touching, and said loud was my specialty, bet he secretly liked it. He snatched the mug, his knuckles brushing mine slow, and muttered I was a problem, liked or not, I'd wear him down. I leaned in, my shoulder pressing his, and said he looked hot plotting courses, bet he'd sailed through worse than me. He turned, his hand hovering near mine, and said sailing was work, girls like me were nonsense. I laughed, tapped the map again, flirty, saying nonsense suited him, bet he'd rescue me from any mess. He gripped my hand again, tighter, his eyes darkening, and said rescuing wasn't on his list, bet I'd sink myself. I shifted, my knee sliding against his, and told him sinking was half the thrill, bet he'd dive in anyway, tough as he was. He shoved the map aside, his fingers grazing mine as I held it, and said I was too close, back off, Jane. I smirked, kept my hand there, my elbow brushing his, and said close was where it got good, bet he felt that spark too. He stood, his shadow falling over me, chair scraping, and said sparks were for fools, bet I'd chase them alone. I pushed the chair back, my shoulder bumping his thigh, and told him fools won sometimes, bet he'd stick around to see it. He rubbed his face, his hand pausing near my arm, tension coiling tight, and I felt the air snap, his breath sharp. I grabbed the mug, took a slow sip, holding his stare, and said he looked damn good with those maps, bet he'd charted wilder nights than this. He took it back, his fingers lingering on mine, and said wild nights were my fairy tale, get lost. I grinned, leaned closer, my elbow pressing his arm, and told him fairy tales were fun, bet he'd star in mine. The wind picked up outside, branches banging the window, and he said I was a storm, bet I'd exhaust him fast. I bumped his knee with mine, flirty, saying storms were his game, bet he'd ride mine out. The glass rattled hard, wind howling, and I stood, my shoulder brushing his chest as I moved, saying he was built for this, bet he liked my kind of trouble. He stepped back, his hand dropping to the desk near mine, and said trouble or not, I was too much, bet I'd pushed too far. I smirked, tossed the map at him, and headed to the kitchen, calling back I'd leave him with the coffee, bet he'd miss me. I heard him slam the mug down, chair creaking, and knew I'd hooked him deep. He wasn't shaking me off. 10 days later, I walked into the living room of our Baton Rouge house, where Doug sat on the couch, piecing together a puzzle of some old ship, the table a mess of cardboard bits. Mom was still at her insurance gig, the afternoon dragging slow, and I dropped onto the armrest near him, my knee brushing his leg, watching him fit a corner piece. He didn't look up, just said I'd better not knock it over. Took him hours. I smirked, picked up a stray piece, twirled it, and said he looked sexy, all focused. Bet he'd puzzled out tougher fixes than this. He shot me a quick glare, grabbed another piece, and said fixes didn't flirt. Bet I'd mess it up if I tried. I slid closer, my hip nudging his shoulder, and handed him the piece, my fingers grazing his slow, saying flirty girls made it fun. Bet he'd missed that spark. He took it, his hand brushing mine, lingering, and slotted it in, muttering I was a spark he didn't need, too distracting. I grinned, leaned in, my elbow resting near his arm, and told him distractions looked good on him. Bet he'd handled rattier crews. He turned, his knee bumping mine, and said crews followed orders. Bet I'd never learn that. I bumped his shoulder back, flirty, saying orders were dull. Bet he'd rather chase me instead. He grabbed the puzzle box, checked the picture, his fingers tapping close to my hand, and said chasing wasn't his game. Bet I'd trip over myself first. I laughed, slid my hand along the table, brushing his wrist, and told him tripping was the thrill. Bet he'd catch me anyway, steady as he was. He paused, his hand hovering near mine, and said catching was for fools. Bet I'd figure that out soon. I leaned closer, my arm pressing his, and said fools got the best stories. Bet he'd star in one with me. He gripped a piece tight, set it down, his elbow nudging mine, and muttered I was spinning nonsense. Bet it'd crash. I stood, stretched, my hip brushing his shoulder again, and grabbed the box, holding it up, saying he looked hot piecing this together. Bet he'd nailed trickier jobs. He snatched it back, his fingers lingering on mine, and said tricky was my thing. Bet I'd break this if I stayed. I sat back down, my knee sliding against his thigh, and told him breaking was fun. Bet he'd fix it just to show off. He turned, his hand landing on the table near mine, close, firm, and said showing off was for kids. Bet I'd tire him out. I smirked, bumped his leg with mine, flirty, saying tiring him sounded tempting. Bet he'd keep up. The room went still, just the tick of the clock, and I picked up another piece, fitted it slow, holding his gaze, saying he was too good at this. Bet he'd puzzle me out too. He took it, his fingers brushing mine again, and said puzzling me was a lost cause. Bet I'd scatter first. I leaned in, my elbow pressing his arm, and told him scattering was my style. Bet he'd chase the pieces. He shifted, his knee nudging mine, and said chasing wasn't worth it. Bet I'd lose him in the mess. I laughed, flirty, bumped his shoulder, and said losing him wasn't an option. Bet he'd stick around. Then the phone rang, neighbor griping about a busted fence from the storm. Doug grabbed it, answered sharp, saying he'd check later, his voice cut through, breaking the moment. I stood, tossed in the box lid, my hand grazing his, and said I'd leave him to it. Bet he'd miss my help. He hung up, turned, his hand tapping near mine, and said help was a stretch. Bet I'd slow him down. I grinned, headed out to walk the dog, calling back he'd speed up for me. Bet on it. I heard him grunt, puzzle pieces clattering, and knew I'd left him tangled, still in my grip. 2 weeks later, I was out in the backyard of our Baton Rouge house, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows over the patchy grass. Mom was inside, vacuuming the living room after her shift at the insurance office, and Doug stood by the grill, flipping burgers, his old jacket slung over a chair, sleeves rolled up. I wandered over, barefoot, kicking a stray twig, and leaned against the picnic table near him, my elbow brushing his arm as he worked the spatula. He didn't flinch, just said I'd better not expect him to cook for me. Bet I'd burn it if I tried. I smirked, bumped his shoulder with mine, and said he looked hot flipping those. Bet he'd grilled for tougher crowds than this. He shot me a sidelong glance, flipped a patty, and said crowds didn't flirt. Bet I'd scare them off anyway. I grinned, slid closer, my hip nudging his side, and told him scaring was my talent. Bet he'd stick around for it. He grabbed a plate, set it down, his hand brushing mine as I reached for a bun, and said talent was pushing it. Bet I'd trip over my own tricks. I laughed, flirty, leaned in, my knee brushing his leg, and said tripping was the fun part. Bet he'd catch me like he did in that storm. He turned, his elbow pressing my arm, and said catching wasn't his job, bet I'd learn to stand straight. I stepped around, grabbed the spatula from his hand, my fingers lingering on his, and gave it a playful flip, saying he looked too good at this, bet he'd mastered hotter fires. He snatched it back, his grip brushing mine slow, and said fires didn't talk back, bet I'd start one just to see. I smirked, bumped his hip with mine, and told him starting fires was my thing, bet he'd fan the flames. He plated a burger, his knee nudging mine, and said fanning wasn't smart, bet I'd burn out fast. I leaned closer, my arm sliding against his, and said burning out sounded thrilling, bet he'd keep the heat going. He grabbed a beer from the cooler, cracked it open, and handed it over, his fingers grazing mine, saying I'd need it, bet I'd chatter through the whole meal. I took a sip, set it down, my hand resting near his on the table, and told him chattering kept it lively, bet he'd listen anyway, tough as he was. He turned, his shoulder brushing mine, and said listening wasn't a promise, bet I'd wear him thin. I bumped his elbow, flirty, and said wearing him thin was tempting, bet he'd hold up like steel. He gripped the spatula, his knuckles brushing my wrist, and muttered I was a test, bet I'd break first. I stepped back, grabbed a bun, tore off a piece, and popped it in my mouth slow, holding his gaze, saying he looked damn good out here, bet he'd ruled decks tougher than this yard. He took the beer, sipped, his hand hovering near mine, and said decks didn't need ruling, just work, bet I'd slack off. I grinned, leaned in again, my knee pressing his thigh, and told him slacking was my charm, bet he'd pick up the slack for me. He set the can down, his arm brushing mine, and said picking up was for suckers, bet I'd figure that out. I bumped his shoulder harder, flirty, saying suckers won sometimes, bet he'd play along. The grill sizzled, smoke curling up, and I grabbed the spatula again, flipped a patty sloppy, saying he was too steady, bet he'd shake things up for me. He took it back, his fingers lingering on mine, and said shaking was my gig, bet I'd tip this whole thing over. I laughed, slid my hand along the table, brushing his, and told him tipping was the rush, bet he'd steady me anyway. He turned, his chest an inch from mine, and said steadying wasn't free, bet I'd owe him. I smirked, bumped his hip, and said owing him sounded fun, bet he'd cash it in. Mom's vacuum roared louder inside, humming through the walls, and I stepped closer, my arm pressing his, saying he was too cool under pressure, bet he'd crack for me. He flipped another burger, his knee nudging mine, and said cracking was my move, bet I'd split first. I leaned in, my hand tapping near his, flirty, and told him splitting was half the game, bet he'd chase the pieces. Then her voice cut through, sharp, yelling from the house about dinner being late. I froze, stepped back, and grabbed the beer, taking a quick swig. Doug turned off the grill, said I'd better move, bet she'd blame me. I bolted inside, calling back he'd miss my heat, bet on it. He grunted, plate in hand, and I knew I'd left him simmering, still mine to play. 3 weeks after the backyard grill, I'd been buzzing with Doug's every grunt and glance, the tension coiling tighter each day in our Baton Rouge house. Mom was at her insurance gig most nights, leaving us alone too often, and I'd decided to push it, slipped into his bedroom late, the hall dark, her car still gone. He was propped on the bed, folding a stack of work shirts, TV muttering some old war flick, and I leaned on the doorframe in a loose tank top and shorts, my bare shoulder catching the dim light. He looked up, froze, and asked what I was doing, bet I'd lost my damn mind. I smirked, stepped in, my hip brushing the dresser, and said I had a gift for him, bet he'd like it. He dropped a shirt, hand still, and said gifts weren't my style, get out before trouble hit. I grinned, sauntered closer, my knee nudging the bed's edge, and told him trouble was the gift, bet he'd unwrap it anyway. He stood fast, his chest an inch from mine, and said I was playing too far, bet I'd regret this stunt. I bumped his shoulder with mine, flirty, saying regrets weren't my thing, bet he'd keep me here. He gripped the bedpost, his knuckles brushing my arm, and muttered I was a storm, bet I'd wreck us both. I leaned in, my elbow pressing his, and said wrecks were fun, bet he'd ride it out. I slid past, my hip grazing his, and grabbed a shirt from the pile, holding it up slow, saying he looked hot in these, bet he'd worn tougher stuff at sea. He snatched it back, his fingers lingering on mine, and said sea didn't flirt, bet I'd sink this fast. I laughed, bumped his knee with mine, and told him sinking was the thrill, bet he'd dive in after me. He turned, his arm brushing my shoulder, and said diving was for fools, bet I'd drown alone. I stepped closer, my hand tapping the bed near his, flirty, saying fools got the best rides, bet he'd join me. He He gripped the shirt tight, his breath sharp, and said rides weren't his game, bet I'd crash. I sat on the bed's edge, my leg brushing his thigh, and leaned back, propping on my elbows, saying he was too steady, bet he'd shake for me tonight. He dropped the shirt, his hand landing near mine, close, firm, and said shaking was my mess, bet I'd tip it over. I grinned, slid my hand along the blanket, fingers grazing his, and told him tipping was the point, bet he'd steady me anyway. He turned, his knee pressing mine, and said steadying wasn't free, bet I'd pay up. I bumped his arm, flirty, saying paying sounded tempting, bet he'd cash it slow. The TV flickered, gunfire popping low, and I shifted, my shoulder brushing his chest, saying he looked too good folding, bet he'd unfold me instead. He grabbed another shirt, his elbow nudging mine, and said unfolding was trouble, bet I'd knot it worse. I leaned closer, my knees sliding against his, and told him knots were fun, bet he'd untangle me just to prove it. He paused, his hand hovering near my arm, and said proving wasn't worth it, I bet I'd twist him up. I smirked, bumped his hip with mine, and said twisting was the game, bet he'd play along. I stood, stepped to the dresser, my back to him, and grabbed his beer from the nightstand, sipping slow, holding his gaze over my shoulder, saying he was too cool in here, bet he'd heat up for me. He took it back, his fingers brushing mine, lingering, and said heat was my trick, bet I'd burn out. I turned, leaned in, my arm pressing his, flirty, and told him burning was the rush, bet he'd fan it. He set the can down, his hand tapping near mine, and said fanning was dumb, bet I'd flame too fast. Then the door creaked. Home early, standing there with a grocery bag, staring at me in my tank top, dug too close. She dropped it, apples rolling, and yelled what the hell this was as me half-dressed in his room? I froze, stepped back, and said it was nothing, bet she'd overreact. Doug stood, hands up, muttering we were just talking, but she stormed in, grabbed my arm, and screamed I'd crossed a line, get out, now. She yanked me to the hall, shouting at him to stay put, packed my stuff in 10 minutes flat, and hauled me to the car, saying we were done here, bet I'd never see him again.